I want to bring in NBC's Kelly Kobiela in London. We have Peter Baker, of course, New York Times chief White House correspondent and an MSNBC political analyst. And Ben Rhodes was Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama. He is also an MSNBC political contributor. Welcome, all of you. Kelly, you first here. What do we know about this deal that the U.S. wants Zelensky to sign, and where does it fit into the talks with Keith Kellogg?
Yeah, Alex, so a proposal put forward last week would have the U.S. owning 50% of Ukraine's rare earth minerals, critical minerals including graphite, uranium, titanium, and lithium, a key component in electric car batteries, in exchange for continued military aid. Now, President Zelensky rejected that, saying it didn't protect Ukrainian interests. The meeting today was meant to focus on a revised pact, somehow get these two sides together, find out what Ukraine needs in return for getting on board with that rare earth mineral deal. President Trump, as you heard, warned the Ukrainian president yesterday that he better move fast to negotiate an end to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or risk not having a country to lead. Vice President Vance today talked about President Trump's negotiating tactics. Take a listen.
It's early, and I think what President Trump, what makes him such an effective negotiator, I've seen this in private, is that he doesn't take anything off the table. When he walks into negotiation, he says everything is on the table. And of course, that makes the heads explode in the American media because they say, why are you talking to Russia? Well, how are you going to end the war unless you're talking to Russia? You've got to talk to everybody involved in the fighting if you actually want to bring the conflict to a close. And I know the president does.
So was there any progress today? Well, that news conference planned after the talks was canceled. It was supposed to include comments by Zelensky and Kellogg, but was changed at the last minute to a photo op. Ukraine's presidential spokesperson said the change was requested by the U.S. side. The White House hasn't commented on that. In the last few minutes, though, we did hear from President Zelensky. He tweeted that he had a productive meeting today, a good discussion. He said there were many important details covered. He said that he was grateful to the United States for all the assistance and bipartisan support, and said it's important for us and the entire free world that America's strength is felt. He said they had a detailed conversation about the battlefield situation, how to return prisoners of war, and effective security guarantees, but also said that peace is paramount, that it needs to be strong and lasting. Alex?
Okay. Kelly Kobiela, thank you so much from London on that. So, Ben, starting with you here, because I want to play a little bit of what the president said last night about this. Take a listen.
We told them that the deal is we'll do something for the rare earth and some oil, et cetera, and that'll be all right. And they agreed to it, more or less. And then Scott Bessent actually went there and was treated rather rudely because essentially they told him, no.
Can you resurrect that deal? Is there anything that you can do?
Yeah, I think I'm going to resurrect it. Or, you know, we'll see what happens, but I'm going to resurrect it, or things are not going to make him too happy.
All right, so National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said this morning that the president is engaged in what he is calling hard diplomacy. Is that what this is?
No, this is just complete and utter capitulation to Russian interest in Ukraine. And let's take a step back here. We had the United States of America, the President of the United States, call Vladimir Putin and essentially initiate a negotiation that excluded Ukraine. So even on Trump's own terms, how are you going to negotiate the end of the war where the negotiations between the United States and Russia and not Ukraine itself that was invaded and that is one of the warring parties, never mind Europe, which has provided more assistance to Ukraine in total than the United States. So Ukraine sees itself shut out at the table. Then you have the Secretary of Defense a few days ago capitulating on the two biggest issues that Ukraine would have to deal with at the table, which is they have to give all their territory that Russia is currently occupying. And keep in mind, that's a lot of people that live in that territory. There's been tens of thousands of children kidnapped and taken from those territories. And they wouldn't get a credible security guarantee because they removed NATO as a potential security partner for Ukraine going forward. In that context, Trump saying, give us 50% of your mineral rights feels like two big powers essentially dividing up Ukraine, and Russia getting to keep chunks of land and the United States getting to get a bunch of natural resources. And so, of course, the Ukrainians are dubious about this proposal. Look, if it was part of a credible commitment to Ukraine to be at the negotiating table, to have a security guarantee from the U.S. and Europe, and to have an investment relationship with the United States that could help rebuild their economy, that might make sense. But I think the reason that this investment, agreement is viewed so skeptically by Ukraine is because of the context in which it's being offered.
Yeah, you picked up exactly what my question is. The fact that you had Mike Waltz talking about an investment, I'm like, I don't know if it sounds like that exactly. Peter, you wrote that by vilifying Mr. Zelensky and shifting blame from the war, rather for the war, from Moscow to Kyiv, Mr. Trump seems to be laying a predicate for withdrawing support for an ally under attack. Can you explain that?
Well, sure. Look, he in the last few days has parroted the Russian talking points, right? That this is, in fact, a war started by Ukraine, not by Russia. He has said that Zelensky is a dictator, even though, of course, he was elected in 2019 in a free and fair election, a landslide election, has a higher approval rating today than Donald Trump does. Whereas says nothing about Vladimir Putin, who actually is a dictator, who has had only farcical elections, not really free and fair by any stretch of the imagination. And so in order to do that, by doing that, what Trump is doing is saying to at least his supporters and perhaps other Americans who might be sympathetic to the view that why should we be investing in Ukraine? Why should we be defending Ukraine? And if he were to negotiate a deal that seems favorable to Russia rather than Ukraine, that Americans should be okay with that because Ukraine is really a villain, not a victim.
Okay, so timing of all this, Ben, we can't forget it's happening before any substantive negotiations with the Russians even begin, right? So if the Russians don't think that the U.S. is ultimately going to back Ukraine, why would they agree to anything?
Well, that's the problem. Some people might say, well, inevitably, Ukraine's going to have to give up some territory, and inevitably, it's difficult to consider them having a full NATO membership. Okay, you might get there at the end of a negotiation, but by putting that out at the beginning, by essentially saying at the beginning that you're going to agree to Russia's terms to end the war, and by beginning to discuss sanctions relief, which was one of the topics that Secretary Rubio discussed with the Foreign Minister Lavrov, you're skipping ahead to all the things that the Russians would get at the end of a negotiation. If you're Putin, why wouldn't you just say, well, look, I'm just going to hold out for some more. This guy's giving me everything. The Russians didn't have to negotiate. They were given everything at the beginning of the negotiation. And if I'm Putin, I've got a bit of an upper hand at the front line. The United States may not be there with further assistance. Why wouldn't Putin press for more? Whether it's more sanctions relief, whether it's more of Ukraine's territory, whether it's more of a guarantee that Ukraine will be this kind of weak and divided state on the back end of the war. That's why this election idea, which is a Russian idea, let's be clear, it's not the United States. It's Russia that wants Ukraine to have an election because they know they can't have an election. They know that millions of people are out of the country, huge swaths of the country are occupied by Russia, troops are at the front line. This is a Russian play to further destabilize Ukraine. And so I think Putin's going to keep pressing the envelope. Peter's covered Putin for many years. He's not going to take the first offer. Why wouldn't he press for more?
Based on that coverage, Peter, your paper has a great story about Vladimir Putin's team trying to convince the Trump administration that they could make millions of dollars by investing in Russia. And it says, quote, in appealing to President Trump, the Kremlin has zeroed in on his desire to make a profit. At the same time, the Russian media is celebrating Trump's remarks about Zelensky, retweeting the president and asking, how long can Zelensky last? So what is your sense of how Russia has tried to pave the way for this pivot from President Trump? Have they helped make it happen, or are they just the beneficiaries?
Well, let's remember, of course, there's a history here, right? That Donald Trump has had this sort of affinity, let's say, for Vladimir Putin going back many years. The Russians intervened in the 2016 election on his behalf, and he has always shown a preference for Putin over even our NATO allies for whom we are treaty bound. And so Putin, a former KGB colonel, learned a long time ago how to manage his relationship with Trump. It's equal parts flattery, equal parts appealing to his vanity, equal parts, appealing to his desire for profit, as the story said. And he understands exactly what may motivate Donald Trump. He, in recent weeks, has talked about how Trump is a strong character and how he, in fact, was cheated by the system, the deep state. Talked about the 2020 election. He's parroting Trump's lines, knowing that that will appeal to Trump, and he's therefore set himself up for a pretty, cordial relationship at the very least. To listen to Trump these last few days talk about the Ukraine war and say not one thing about Russia's culpability for it, to say not one thing about what Russia has done in Ukraine, but to pretend or seemingly imply that all the death and destruction was actually the fault of the Ukrainians themselves is very striking. And you're right, they are celebrating in Moscow right now.
I mean, look, he can say it, but how many people believe that? I mean, we've all watched this all unfold. So here's the big picture question, Ben. Do we know who's driving the talks and who's setting the terms?
I think it's pretty clear that the Russians are driving the talks and setting the terms. And let me just give you one more example. They seem to not want to negotiate with Keith Kellogg, the envoy, because he's taken a harder line in the past. The Russians don't want him at the table, and so he's not. He's at the kids' table. To Trump, Ukraine and Europe are not serious players. They're not at the table between the United States and Russia. Russia is setting the agenda. We're discussing, you just raised the oil licensing question. That is currently against the law. And the United States has sanctions making it illegal for that kind of investment and relationships to take place. So Russia already has the United States negotiating about things that U.S. law currently prohibits. I mean, that's how far the pendulum has swung in the last week. And so this is their wildest dream in Moscow, to essentially have the war potentially ending on their terms, or at least the United States supporting that, to have them from the cold of isolation. Suddenly they're back meeting with the United States bilaterally. That's a signal to the rest of the world that Russia is no longer isolated by certainly the West. And they're talking about economic cooperation and bilateral cooperation in the future, as if they didn't just invade a sovereign country, kill tens of thousands of people. That's all being whitewashed before our eyes.